Good day, everyone, and welcome to the CIPC podcast. This podcast is just another effort by the CIPC to inform the public about various issues, being mostly CIPC services, CIPC compliances, and also understanding ways of transacting with the CIPC. So there's many of these videos that will be following with different subject that will be addressing with different subject matter experts that will be watering down the explanation so that we all understand what is required from us as business owners as well as people who are involved in business. We understand as a podcast is much more of a relaxed conversation so that we meet the public where they spend most of their time, which is social media and your YouTubes, for you to have better understanding of the services that the CIPC is offering and initiatives that the CIPC is involved in. Now, today is our first subject and guest. Today we'll be speaking about beneficial ownership. I think a lot of people know it as BO, but the BO mainly just stands for beneficial ownership. And today we're joined by Mr. Joy Mateka, who is the Senior Manager of Corporate Compliance and Disclosure Regulations. Good afternoon, Mr. Mateka.
Good afternoon, Ufetse. And it's a pleasure for me to join you on this podcast.
No, I hope you're good. Thank you very much, sir. I hope you're doing very well there on your side. Today we're speaking beneficial ownership, Mr. Mateka. So maybe just as a tone setter for us, and obviously giving us our first marching orders on our first podcast, how would you basically explain to us what is this new creature that we're all faced with called beneficial ownership?
Thanks very much for the opportunity. I must say beneficial ownership is a concept which is really new to our jurisprudence in terms of company law. It essentially refers to people who are called ultimate owners of entities. Many of us know that directors or shareholders would be the people that we are familiar with. However, we seldom know about persons who ultimately own or control an entity in the background. So beneficial ownership is really about having entities becoming transparent about who owns them. So that's in a nutshell how I can describe beneficial ownership.
No, that's lovely.
Who controls?
So based on your explanation is more on who controls and who owns the beneficial interest at the end of the day behind any entity for that matter.
Yes, that's right.
No, that's lovely. But I guess this must be a very monumentous task looking at the number of companies we have in South Africa. Now, talking about the number of companies we have, Mr. Mateka, looking at the compliance thereof of beneficial ownership or the submissions of BO, which companies really are required to submit this beneficial ownership? Because we do know that there's talks of affected companies and unaffected companies and the BO disclosure submissions that companies are required to make to the CIPC. So which companies are those that are required to comply?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. All entities that are registered with CIPC are required to make disclosures in terms of who ultimately owns them. We know that it is not in all instances where there is someone controlling the entity in the background, but then we expect entities to tell us through the filing of what we call is a securities register. Some call it a share register. We expect every company to declare to CIPC who owns what percentage of interest in their entity, as well as who, for example, has got voting rights, which leads to effective control over an entity, amongst other things. So it is public companies, private companies, closed corporations, external companies, non-profit companies, all entity types have to file BO with CIPC. However, the distinction between affected and non-affected companies comes in this way. Because some entities are listed with the stock exchanges, some are with the JSE, some are with the other stock exchanges that we know, there's 4 of them in the country, those entities will have a lot of trading happening every second of the day. And therefore, they are categorized as affected companies. And what happens is that in terms of the regulations, it is allowed for CIPC to source the data on such companies from organizations like Straight, because most of the filings will be happening through the trading platform that goes through Straight, and that record is available to CIPC at any time. But then that's the only reason why we call them affected companies. The other word is regulated companies, you know. However, the non-affected companies are those who are normal entities that are required to keep records of who owns them, a shareholder register. Then at the end of every financial year, at least, they have to report to CIPC as to who ultimately owns them. And that record is kept by CIPC so that when there are times for law enforcement to conduct investigations, they are able to do that unhindered. Thank you.
Thank you very much there, Mr. Mateka. I think you clarified it quite well there, that what the distinction is and how the two different classifications are required, obviously, to comply between your normal entities as well as what we would regard as an affected or regulated entity. But when you speak about the beneficial owner, Mr. Mateka, what are the types, or when we say who the beneficial owner is, specifically, what are the types of ownership, or what do we mean mainly when we say who is the actual beneficial owner?
A beneficial owner is a warm body behind an entity. A beneficial owner cannot be a legal person. A legal person in the form of another company or in the form of another legal arrangement. Ultimately, there has to be a natural person behind every entity. It is that person whom every company has to declare to us as to who owns them and what are their credentials in terms of addresses, how much percentage they own in the entity, do they have power to appoint the board, change management, appoint the CEOs, amongst other powers that they may have. But it's essentially a warm body who exercises effective control over an entity.
All right. Thanks for that, Mr. Mateka. Now, I think you've laid the ground pretty well as far as our understanding of what beneficial ownership is, who is a beneficial owner, and who is then required to comply when it comes to the submissions that are supposed to be made to the CIPC regarding beneficial ownership. Now, for instance, we've informed the public about submissions, who needs to submit, and the warm bodies that they have to account for as beneficial owners of entities. But now, when it comes to the CIPC, what is then the CIPC's role for companies then that do not comply? We do know that some might declare not knowing, and some might say they don't know how to go about it, hence some of these videos that we are doing. But then when it comes to the CIPC, our role as the CIPC in non-compliant companies, what would our role be?
Okay, CIPC applies a balanced approach to enforcement. One, CIPC says to entities, here is what is required of you. Meaning we will educate, and then enforce. So part of what CIPC is doing now is to say, we are taking you through a requirement that the Companies Act has on every legal entity in South Africa. And there are timelines to filing in terms of beneficial ownership. This is also to ensure that we align ourselves with the transparency objectives as contained in the Companies Act. So our economy has to be a transparent economy so that persons who invest in our economy can have confidence that they will not make investments and ultimately there are people in the background who control entities to the disadvantage of investors, amongst others. So with this requirement for beneficial ownership, we expect every company to really be in compliance with the Companies Act. Failure by companies to comply will attract an investigation on CIPC part. CIPC has got powers in terms of the Companies Act to initiate investigations proactively and or can allow complainants to lodge complaints so that we can investigate. However, in this instance, because the requirement has been introduced on the 1st of April last year, we know that it's almost a year later. So companies who are supposed to file are expected to have filed by now because we know that based on their own records, they know exactly who owns them. All they needed to do was just to declare to CIPC that so-and-so owns us. So CIPC will take steps, will investigate, seek cooperation of the company to rectify the situation. Failure by company to comply will lead us to issuing a compliance notice, which would mean it's now going to be a record against that entity. That is not going to be helpful in terms of what we expect entities to. They should have a clean record. Once a compliance notice is issued, it means that there's a black mark against their record as an entity. Thanks.
All right. Thanks for that, Mr. Mateka. So in other words, going with your explanation, the issuance of a compliance notice is one of the remedial actions that are taken post an investigation of a non-compliant entity.
That is correct. So an entity has a choice to cooperate, or an entity can receive a compliance notice. With a compliance notice, it means that they have no intentions of really complying with our request for them to remedy the non-compliance.
All right. Thanks for that, Mr. Mateka. Now, obviously, once the compliance notice has been issued as one of the remedial actions, when it comes to administrative fines that would be applicable for non-compliant entities and endorsement of entities' disclosure certificates, how would we explain the administrative fines and how would they be applicable to these entities that are non-compliant with their BO submissions?
Right. So an entity which fails to comply with the compliance notice leaves CIPC with no choice but to have CIPC pursue this matter through the courts, where the courts are empowered to issue an administrative fine, which on its own would mean CIPC will also be sort of authorized to endorse the certificate. So whenever a disclosure certificate is issued or checked against a particular company, it will reflect that this company has failed to comply with the compliance notice that was issued by CIPC. That's why I'm saying it leaves a black mark on an entity's profile. Whether it's banks, whether it's prospective investors, they will always have access to that knowledge that this entity that I'm going to enter into business with does not respect compliance orders that are issued by a regulator. And that will not be a good cue that a company should be following. If they want to be seen as a well-governed entity, an entity that respects laws of running a business, They would not want to go to a stage where CIPC has to take them to court and issue a fine.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Mateka. Now, when you speak about a black mark, obviously that will be put on an entity for non-compliance, and you've also further confirmed that when you speak of beneficial owners, we're speaking of physical warm bodies or people who are ultimately the benefiters behind these entities. Now, are there any checks that are conducted between beneficial owners with the register of persons convicted of financial crimes?
Yes. Now, thanks for that question. One of the key requirements by Financial Action Task Force is to make sure that jurisdictions do not place persons who are not eligible on the registers of either directors, members, or beneficial owners. And in terms of our own Companies Act, Section 69 talks about the persons who are ineligible to serve as directors. And one of those persons includes people who are convicted of financial crimes. We all know that people who've been convicted of fraud, people who've been convicted, for example, of state capture and or such similar, I would say, crimes, they would be categorized under the category of persons of convicted of financial crimes. So such persons are not supposed to be serving as directors in companies or at least as beneficial owners. So we do those checks. We call our register in the office a delinquent directors register. That's the easiest word to use. But that register gets updated by data that we receive from law enforcement, from courts, from any authority that is credible, recognizable under the law to serve as input into our DDR register. So the BO administration includes us checking the DDR register. In that way, we are able to filter and sift out people who are not supposed to be on the BO register. Thank you.
No, hundreds. When you speak of FATF, I guess one's mind fully jumps to grey listings. As you said, it's a task force to address the unfortunate situation we find ourselves in. So when it comes to BO and grey listings, why the BO register from the perspective of FATF and the IO5?
Oh, thanks for that question. The Financial Action Task Force goes on to assess economies based on 11 immediate outcomes. And one of the immediate outcomes is on beneficial ownership transparency. So the economy's financial system is assessed based on those various 11 areas of effectiveness. If we can demonstrate that we are effective in how we perform our supervisory role over banks, over attorneys and estate agents, over casinos, motor car dealerships, amongst other things, including how we regulate transparency of beneficial ownership information for use by law enforcement. FATF is most likely to take us off the grey list, or at least in their subsequent evaluation will not put us on a grey list, because we'll be viewed as being effective in how we administer our oversight over those key areas, especially being able to prosecute people who get involved in money laundering or who finance terror activities. So by being transparent and taking dissuasive steps against people who break our transparency rules, we will be able to avoid grey listing as a country. So that FATF of whom CIPC is a member. Together, in fact, as South Africa, we are a member of FATF because of being members of the G20. We play a role in ensuring that amongst our peers, we also assist one another in how we share information, because beneficial owners are moving from country to country. So these natural persons, like companies, they move from country to country. So that is why the system of peer reviews, so that a beneficial owner who's convicted in Botswana or Lesotho or Ghana should not be allowed to serve as a beneficial owner on a South African company. So I think this multilateralism allows economies to be able to hold each other accountable on how they administer issues around transparency and prevention of money laundering and terror financing. So CIPC is doing its bit by establishing this register and ensuring that it holds accurate, up-to-date, complete data on such persons, and to make it available to law enforcement to be able to take steps against such persons. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for that, Mr. Mateka. I think you've done a great job in making people understand primarily the whole concept of BO. And I think with the last question of FATF and the grey listing, I think the bottom message there is that the more we comply and the more we're transparent around our dealings, the better it is for our economy. I would like to afford you maybe a parting shot, Mr. Mateka, at the end of our conversation today. What would your parting shot be for today's conversation?
Thanks, Ofenza. I think it's quite key for us to encourage our owners of companies to remember their fiduciary responsibilities. As a company director, you should know who you are running the company for. It cannot be that there is a share register, but in that share register, you don't know exactly who's holding interest on behalf of who. So company directors are having a responsibility and an obligation to ensure that they assist the country in getting out of this grey listing by complying with this requirement for beneficial ownership filing and avoiding the regulator having to go after you before you can comply. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mateka. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the effort today of making us all understand even deeper the implications and the good benefit that comes from beneficial ownership compliance. Now, as the CIPC podcast,
thank you.
This is just, as I said, one of many to come. Thanks for joining us. Please do stay tuned on our channels and social media platforms for more of such videos to come. And as my parting shot, I would say, as Ofenza from the CIPC, continue doing business, but don't forget to comply. Till next time, I'm out.